So emissions regulations always create a lot of questions, maybe even a lot of confusion, speculation, and so we are very excited to have our very own Dave Piech with us this afternoon, and he's the Vice President of Engine Compliance for NAFTA for CNH Industrial, and he is going to talk about kind of just share some information and details about emissions, including maybe addressing any speculation on Tier 5 compliance.
Good afternoon, and thank you for sticking it out for the last day here going in. I'm going to be talking about Tier 5, so if you have any questions, we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the very end, and we can backtrack into any of the slides. Want to give you a little bit of a history here, though, on regulations and how they come about. Really, you have to think about how they progress, and what goes around comes around. So you have light-duty pickups and vans, and there's regulations there. Those are the oldest regulations on the book. You have heavy-duty regulations for truck and tractor, and then you have the regulations for non-road. And finally, what we're going to be talking about is keeping an ear to the ground, really what we kind of see on the horizon coming forward with the regulations. We want to talk about what goes around comes around. So what I wanted to think about is, think about your car. What happened in your car has progressed over time. For some of the older people with gray hair and remember carburetors and plugs and stuff like that, you know, that's what it was back in the 70s. But think about your car. You open up the hood now and you can't even figure out what it is. Maybe you know where the oil goes and where the dipstick is, but that's really about it. But what happens in cars went to trucks, and then finally what happens in trucks goes to non-road. And as the technology goes from the automotive to the on-highway to the non-road. The other things we have to think about are the regulatory focus, and the major criteria of pollutants are oxides of nitrogen, or NOx as you might hear, particulate matter or PM, and then finally hydrocarbons. All that stuff makes either soot in the air or it makes smog. Actually, that picture is from China, and I've been to China, and that actually is the way it looks. That is a picture that you might have seen in northern Indiana near Gary, near the steel mills, back about 40 years ago or 50 years ago. So we've really cleaned up the air, but the emissions, though, are still bad in other countries. Fuel economy and greenhouse gases, or GHGs, as you've heard, and that's a big thing about climate change and everything else, no. And then finally, diagnostics. And in diagnostics, it's that onboard diagnostics, or OBD. That's the mill light, the light that comes on in your car when you don't put the gas cap back on, or other things like that. So those are the three major areas I really want to touch on and talk about thematically as we go through. The major drivers in this area are two. One is the US EPA that's on the East Coast, and the other is our friends in California on the West Coast, the California Air Resources Board. And those are really the major drivers at creating these newer, more stringent regulations. So just touching on light-duty regulations, right now we've got emissions are at a Tier 3, Lev 3 level. What does that mean? Is that, again, we're squeezing the emissions down even more so that the cars and light-duty trucks that are coming out are going to be even more cleaner. In some respects, in some areas such as LA and also the San Joaquin Valley, which are the most polluted areas in the US right now, these cars will actually be cleaning up some of the air as they drive. That's what has been commented on. These new emissions are coming forward from 2017 through 2025. And to make sure you understand that on light-duty trucks, so under 10,000, by 2025, the light-duty trucks, so a F-150, 1500, will up to a 2500, will have to meet the same standards as your passenger car. And that's, again, you're talking a bigger vehicle carrying a lot different weight specifications. And then by 2020, you also have to certify these as a chassis. Right now, you can certify the engine separately from the vehicle. That means it's a type of different certification. You actually tune the engine different ways. But by 2020, there's going to be some changes there. Fuel economy, interesting, prior to the new year, the ex-EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy reaffirmed that the fuel economy targets for cars for 50 plus miles per gallon by 2025, that was achievable, that was going to happen. That was right before the end of the year. A lot of people have talked about, and you may have seen some stuff in the news right now, that wait a second, Trump and Pruitt, who's the new EPA administrator, may be adjusting this and may be looking at this again. I don't know what's going to happen because we're waiting to see. We're only 50 days into the Trump administration. We'll have to see what can be done and what will be done. But to give you a perspective, for the regulation actually described a heavy-duty pickup, if my recollection was a Silverado, that by 2025, this heavy-duty pickup was supposed to get 33 miles per gallon on average. And where we are today in 2017, utilizing the EPA's own fuel economy requirements that they publish, they have either the similar crew cabs pickup at 17 miles a gallon or a hybrid pickup at 20 miles a gallon. So you're talking about the regulations having to require almost doubling of the fuel economy on pickups. Now that's going to add clearly cost, and it's going to possibly affect performance. Now manufacturers are going to be addressing that as best they can, but that is, from your planning standpoint, again, this is what the regulations are requiring, more sophistication. And then finally, diagnostics, thematically, diagnostics are reviewed every 2 years. The California Air Resources Board and EPA go through a review process, primarily in California, and they review this and make the onboard diagnostics even more stringent as it goes on. For heavy-duty truck on-highway emission regulations, the latest thing from last year, from August, was that the heavy-duty greenhouse gas phase 2 was adopted in August of 2016. What this requires to do is that heavy-duty trucks are supposed to have a 25% reduction, i.e. they're supposed to become 25% more fuel efficient by 2027. Now the cost estimates for these heavy-duty Class 8 trucks is about an extra $14,000 on a truck, although the EPA calculation of the payback period is 2 to 3 years. When I put that in perspective, when as people may know, for heavy-duty trucks, when they had the 07 and the 2010 rule come through, that's the one that required DPF, that's the one that required SCR. EPA had some estimates on the cost estimates there. Point being is the actual cost estimates were by EPA, the actual cost was almost 370%, so really almost 4 times what the EPA own cost estimates were going to be. So I'll, just applying the 4 times to the 14,000, you can see that heavy-duty on-highway trucks, there could be a significant cost increase over the next several years on that. Also, now this is very important to understand as we go and talk and transition to non-road emission regulations. CARB has proposals for on-highway trucks to reduce an additional 90% reduction in NOx. And they need to have that by 2024. I'll explain that a little bit later, but they have proposed that in several regulatory workshops already. California and other agencies petitioned EPA back last year to actually force EPA or require EPA to have these reductions on on-highway trucks to move forward. The EPA reviewed that, and as of December 2016, the EPA responded that, one, the EPA specifically noted that the last time the on-highway regulations were changed was back in 2001, almost 16 years ago. Number two, they said, okay, we're going to start and agree to work on a rule, a combined rule, a national rule, so that we don't have a California rule and a other 49 state rule. We're going to work on a rule that would become effective in 2024. For them to do that, they'd have to finalize that rule because of regulation and regulatory requirements. They'd have to finalize that regulation by 2019. But this is very important from a sequencing standpoint as we look out over the next 8 to 10 years. EPA had already looked at saying we're going to need to make these reductions in emissions. We understand the states are requiring this to meet various local pollution requirements. Potential issues having to do with that, how repeatable are these emissions? You have to understand that you're talking about a Class 8 truck at 80,000 pounds going down the highway being almost as clean as the Prius right next to it. Almost as clean. You're talking about the reliability and durability. People may remember what happened in 2007 and 2010 with the DPFs and also with the SCRs as they came on. There were a little bit of kinks in those systems as they were first put onto the market. And finally, diagnostics and OBD, and really the big question is how much is this all going to cost to really squeeze down those emissions. And finally, again, it's this diagnostics and OBD that just keeps on churning through every 2 years. Now, non-road emissions, put that all in the background. And again, light duty, heavy duty on highway. For non-road emissions, the one thing I can tell you with any degree of certainty is that, as people may be aware, there's changes coming to the Transitional Program for Equipment Manufacturers, or TPEM, or some people call it FLEX. This is where you can buy certain equipment right now with older engine technology. This would be Tier 3 or Tier 4 interim technology. This will end starting this year. So if you have Tier 3 in some of the equipment, the Tier 3 period will start ending at the end of 2017. Two different requirements. First off, talk about the U.S. U.S. requirement will say that if you have a engine, a Tier 3 engine that goes into the equipment, it has to be built into the equipment by the end of this year. Then you have another year to pull that engine into the United States. So I'm talking, for the under 130, excuse me, the over 130, it has to be done by 2017. For the 56 to 130, it'll have to be done by 2018. And then you have an extra year to import that. For our Canadian friends, it's a little bit different. The Canadian rule actually states that the engine and equipment must be built and imported into Canada by the end of the period. So unlike the extra year you get here in the US to import it, if you build the equipment down here and you want to bring it up into Canada under a TPEM program or under a Canada Unique program, you have to get it in by the end of the period. And so for the over 130, it has to be done by the end of this year, and for the 56 to 130, it has to be done by the end of next year. Now Canada is a little bit unique in a sense that they have a variation on the rule that once you get done with the Tier 3 engines, you can use an interim Tier 4 engine, and you can slide into that. The U.S. doesn't have that one to the other. You either had to do Tier 3 or interim Tier 4. But this is a definite. This is not going to change. This has been on the books for many years. As far as the non-road emission regulations, however, and this is where we're coming to where we started at, Tier 5 is coming. Let me give you a little bit of background what European Stage 5 non-road mobile machinery is. You hear a lot of things. Think of it as Tier 4 plus. And what do I mean by that? In general, it has parity that the Europeans actually have similar standards now to the U.S. standards. So for example, Europeans didn't have specific, there was a divergence in the European and the U.S. standards under 19 and over 560 kilowatt. Now essentially they're the same. It adds a however, there is a slight difference in that it adds a particulate number, meaning you actually have to go out and measure how many little particles are coming out the tailpipe of the vehicle from the engine, and a slightly smaller, lower particulate matter or PM requirement. This is going to force a diesel particulate filter to be put onto European machines. So like I said, it's a Tier 4 plus in that it squeezes and requires a DPF to put on it. Other than that, the standards are relatively the same. US EPA Tier 5. Now I do want to mention, and let's go back a little bit to the other regulations, especially the on-highway. There's no formal activity. However, the last major rule for non-road regulations was in 2004. That's important. Remember, the EPA specifically said the last major rule for the on-highway regulations was 2001. So history repeats itself. So I would anticipate that the EPA and California would take a look at new non-road regulations. It's also interesting to note in one of the petitions that the state of California and some of the other agencies put out, besides wanting lower emissions on trucks, they did mention specifically that they needed to have reductions from non-road engines too. So it's buried in the petitions. There's no formal response by EPA, but you already know, especially California is looking at it. No formal activity on fuel economy or onboard diagnostics. The one thing I'll talk about on diagnostics, you may have heard a lot of the lawsuits and other things going on with the right to repair, and that has to do with where you go in and you can monitor or change or do other things to the engine control features. I'll caution that because, as I'll mention a little bit later, changing the way the engine runs has both safety and it has EPA or environmental impact. And you just don't get anything for free, especially here in Las Vegas. But in California and other states, they look at how these adjustments of the engines are done. And so if anybody goes in and adjusts how an engine is done, that may be a violation of the law. So again, what we have is what comes around, goes around, and the question is, at what point in time might these regulations come in? To really take a summary, and the vision here is to 2025. What we know as of today, light-duty regulations are going to require lower emissions. They're going to require higher fuel economy, and diagnostics are going to increase over time. Heavy-duty vehicles, there is a question mark on the emissions. We'll see what happens, and I want to talk about that in the last slide here, especially with the new Trump administration. But we'll have to see how that transpires. Non-road, I would anticipate that if something happens with trucks, keep your eye on trucks. If something happens with trucks, something will then happen with non-road equipment. We utilize a similar type of technology. SCR is used on the trucks, used on the non-road. DPFs are used on the trucks, used on the non-road. Fuel economy, that's a bigger question because you can measure it easily on a truck, but how do you really measure it on a wheel loader, or how do you measure it on a grader? It's not the same. You can't go down the same road and do it. So that's going to be a big question on how they can measure and look at greenhouse gases. Diagnostics is something that's out there. They do it on trucks, but again, and cars, but that's a big question of whether that's going to transpire. So through 2025, I would anticipate that for non-road, we will see some reduced emissions. We might see some fuel economy, at least engine-based, and possibly even diagnostics, but those are all big questions. Think about California, and that's very important in the current administration. Right now, California has plans to, one, have reduced greenhouse gases, and two, lower NOx emissions. They have to do that because of their greenhouse gas plans. Air quality in LA and San Joaquin basins need improvements by 2031. Now, California has separate approval authority to come up with new regulations, but they have to have the EPA approve that. And then also for people in California, there are operator rules that are required. Now, talk about the big player on the new boss, not the same as the old boss. Trump transition, we're still waiting to see what happens here. Pruitt has been confirmed, and he's now in. He's making very broad suggestions, 20% cut with EPA, cut in budget, and people. We're also looking at a regulatory hold-in review, and then also what's called a 2-for-1, where you take, for every regulation you want to start, you have to take 2 regulations out. And then there's also a Congressional Review Act. All those put together make, right now, trying to look into the future, trying to crystal ball what's going on. We're anticipating that there will be a reduction, at least in some regulations. There will be a review of other regulations, and combined, that the regulatory agenda will become slower. We've already seen this in the Federal Register and what regulations are put out there between just last year and these first few months. But we'll have to see how once Pruitt gets going, how he puts together the entire organization. The last item I want to mention is about authority songs, but some of the enforcement actions. I'll just straight address it up. People have heard about Volkswagen, people have heard about Fiat Chrysler. There are a whole bunch of other enforcement actions and other things going on there in litigation. So that may have an effect on what companies do and how they do that. So we'll have to see how all this plays out. So here's the point. I gave you a whole bunch of stuff, but I really didn't answer the fundamental question. Here's tier 5 coming to the US. With the prognostication I have right now, I know things are going to change. I just don't know where they're going to go. My anticipation, when you look at the history of everything, the regulations have come to tier 3, tier 4 interim, tier 4 final. You know there's going to be a next step. When is that going to happen? Very likely, in my thought, it's in the 2025 timeframe that you're going to start to see new regulations come on board. Appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you very much.